Welcome back. You're watching the SABC's Prime News. Now, earlier on, we showed you a story from the United States that was filed by our reporter, Sherwin Bryce-Pease, where the country's government has pretty much shut down. And this, I'm afraid, comes at the anniversary of the inauguration of the country's President, Donald Trump. We're joined now by Sherwin Bryce-Pease in New York to give us an update on the situation. Sherwin, thanks very much for joining us. A year into his presidency and government is shut.
Well, it was shut. It certainly is shut at the moment, but I can update you, Peter. Some breaking news out of Washington is that the Senate has just voted by an 81-18 majority. Of course, Senator John McCain, the ailing senator, one missing from the 100 Senate vote, to reopen the government. So it will remain closed for the rest of Monday, but the federal government will reopen tomorrow because finally Republicans and Democrats in the Senate have found a compromise. They are voting on what they call a continuing resolution. Essentially, it's an extension of a budget deal that will run until February 8th. And hopefully by then, some of the Democratic concerns, particularly action on immigration reform, will be able to be accomplished before that February 8th deadline. But certainly, as you mentioned in your introduction, the irony is certainly here amongst all of us as Donald Trump celebrated the first anniversary of his inauguration with a government shutdown.
So it was quite a few days, actually, and quite a few things that have been happening. Not just that government was busy the senators were busy trying to push through the bill to make sure that government stays open, but also around the country, women marched in their numbers, as they did a year ago, against President Trump.
Absolutely right, Peter. Of course, this was not only the one-year anniversary of Donald Trump's presidency, where he purported to have the largest inauguration crowd ever in the history of inaugurations. There was also a very massive turnout the day after his inauguration, when about 1 million people in Washington, D.C. alone, and several 100,000 around the country and the world protested against the agenda that the Donald Trump inauguration represented. So we saw again in New York over the weekend, some 200,000 people here, 600,000 took to the streets in Los Angeles, 300,000 in Chicago, some of the big centers, of course, many more across the country, to protest this agenda. But what their main aim in these protests was, Peter, was to push for more women to run for office. You know, if you look at what agencies like UN Women are trying to achieve, one of their big push in terms of how to arrest sexual harassment in the workplace, undermining of women's rights, is to actually vote for women in office. And you need more women to run if you want to vote for them. And so that was really the main thrust of these protests we saw around the country this weekend.
All right, so a year on, he made a lot of promises in the run-up to the election, and people voted for him in their numbers, believing that he would follow through. When we look back, has he been able to, we know he hasn't built the wall, but has he been able to achieve anything that he promised?
Well, absolutely. I mean, I think he's still fighting vociferously for this wall. We might actually have funding for the wall agreed to by Democrats in any future deal on immigration, particularly on the deferred action for childhood arrivals, what you call the dreamers in this country. So Democrats have in principle agreed to fund this wall to the tune of, I believe, $18 billion. So that might very well be one of the compromises that Democrats agree to, so that they can better position themselves in terms of broad immigration reform in this country. Of course, they passed sweeping tax reforms. Most notably in those tax reforms late last year was the corporate tax rate reduction from 35% to 21%. And this has been welcomed by the market. I mean, the president himself tweets a lot about the New York Stock Exchange reaching record highs. a growth of some 40% in the first year of his presidency. But I do think that begins to then beg the question whether this was a president that inherited an economy with sound fundamentals, as opposed to what happened to Barack Obama in 2008, when essentially the world was falling apart because of the economic and housing collapse we experienced here in the United States that precipitated a global collapse. So clearly the fundamentals here have been better. I think it's fair to say that a president cannot achieve a massive turnaround in any economy simply in 365 days, and Barack Obama would be the first person to tell you that.
All right, so when we look back at these 365 days, they certainly have been momentous, sometimes scary. His Twitter feed has kept us enthralled. Just describe some of the challenges that he's had during the course of this past year. I mean, a lot of the things that happened along the way might have sunk other presidencies.
Absolutely. This is the Teflon president, I think he's been described as. I mean, he famously said when he was running for president that he could kill someone on Fifth Avenue outside his apartment and they'd still vote for him. And I think there's a sense that that might very well be the case. Nothing seems to bring down this president, certainly as it pertains to the 35 to 40% of his core base supporters. But let's not forget that there's another 60% of the American population that perhaps isn't as charmed by what this president represents. I think it's been a very difficult year for his advisors and his aides in the White House, particularly as they need to respond to some of the things he says on Twitter, often from the bed he sleeps in overnight. Early tweets in the morning, usually a barrage of tweets that really do set the political agenda for the day. And as I've said in these discussions with you before, you know, you have a communications team at the White House that is very focused on what this president's agenda is and how, from a communications point of view, they are able to achieve that. And when he goes off message, particularly when he takes on partisan fights on Twitter or, you know, calls people silly nicknames, I think that distracts from the broader agenda that this president seeks to achieve. So from a journalist perspective, having covered this president, it's a very erratic president. It's very difficult for him to stay on message. And I think in the last 48 hours, we've seen some distance between the White House and members of Congress. And without the president's intervention, they have now managed to come to an agreement to reopen the government. So a little less Trump appears to have been the magic potion here, if you will.
All right, and that's where we'll leave it as we look back. 365 days of Donald Trump, and if that was his apprenticeship, one wonders what will happen this year after a year of practice. Thanks very much indeed, Sherwin. That was Sherwin Bryce-Pease, reporter from New York.